Spooky, scary skeletons and shivers down your spine. Shrieking skulls will shock your soul, seal your doom tonight.
Genre is a difficult thing to pin down with an exact definition. The boundaries of genre are extremely blurred, with many films overlapping into multiple genres or melding them together. Halloween is obviously a horror film. I'd say Jaws is a horror film too, but it's not as obvious. Is Jurassic Park a horror film? No? Basically, this is all to say that if you spent any time in film history, then you know how annoying the question is, what was the first time blank happened? So saying something was the first horror film is aimless, especially for a genre that has evolved so much over the course of 130 years. So let's start pre-1920. The pre-1920 portion of film history has many short films in it. Many of the silent films of this era were what were known as trick films, which were essentially little films that sought to showcase special effects that were extremely revolutionary for this time. People often viewed these trick films as if they were magic tricks. Many trick films were literally magic shows. Horror films of this era were mostly just creating cool imagery, usually of satanic material or the undead, which were extremely shocking for the time. They might not fit neatly into the category of horror from a modern perspective, but it was the closest thing that the pre-1920 era had. The first arguable horror film was a short by the inventive filmmaker pioneer Georges Méliès called
La Manoir du Diable.
Méliès was an illusionist who basically invented special effects. He was incredibly creative with how to portray teleportation and magic within his trick films, and this is a prime example of it. There's also
Satan se divierte.
in 1907, which is essentially a magic show, but the guy is dressed as a skeleton. Again, not necessarily scary in that sense, but it's what a horror movie would be from the early 1900s.
La Maison ensorcelée.
Was most likely the first depiction of a haunted house in film, a genre that would become incredibly prevalent in horror. There's also L'Inferno in 1911, which was based on Inferno from the Divine Comedies. This one has incredible imagery and is one of the earliest surviving feature films ever. There are many others, but they all lie within the same vein. Then 1920 came along. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari comes out in 1920 and is arguably the first real horror film. It is about a hypnotist who uses a sleepwalker to commit murders. This is more in line with what we consider today as a horror film. The film is the quintessential example of what is known as German Expressionism. Characteristics of German Expressionism are jagged angles, high heights, exaggerated performances, chiaroscuro lighting, etc., all of which are present in this film. German Expressionist style, while not completely relegated to the horror genre, started forming the first conventions of the genre. Another example of German Expressionism in horror is 1922's Nosferatu by F.W. Murnau. Nosferatu is my personal favorite silent film and is absolutely incredible. It holds up even to this day in my opinion, and is genuinely scary at times. Nosferatu is basically the story of Dracula, but the filmmakers didn't want to buy the rights to Bram Stoker's novel, so they just changed the name. But Nosferatu started the trend of vampires in horror, which will continue for a long time. Lon Chaney flourishes in the 20s as well. Lon Chaney was this incredible silent film actor that was known for his chameleon-like skills to use makeup and effects to transform himself into all types of horrifying things, such as The Phantom in 1925's The Phantom of the Opera, and the lost film London After Midnight in 1927. Lon Chaney can be credited as helping start the body horror subgenre in horror. 1927 rolls around, and The Jazz Singer is released, becoming the first feature film with sound, which obviously revolutionized the entire film industry, including horror. Enter the age of the Universal monster movie. The 30s created a boom for the horror genre when Universal Pictures released Dracula and Frankenstein in the same year of 1931. 1932 brings us The Mummy, and 1933 brings The Invisible Man. Universal Studios also released other horror films that weren't part of the classic monsters, like The Black Cat in 1934. The monster films also garnered sequels like 1935's Bride of Frankenstein and 1936's Dracula's Daughter. These sequels paved the way for the first cinematic universe. The 1940s continued Universal Studios' streak of horror films. The Wolfman, another classic monster movie, is released in 1941. The 40s also erupted in sequels of horror movies, which is very fitting for the horror genre, especially looking at the 80s and 90s. One of the main issues of horror movies at the time was the PCA. I've talked about the PCA a little bit in my Texas Chainsaw video, but essentially the Production Code Administration was a group that would look through scripts and film edits and decide if they fit standards to be released. They were made to help filmmakers dodge censors, which were extremely prevalent at the time because films were not protected under the First Amendment rights until 1952. Obviously, the horror genre was one that struggled to dodge the censors the most, and these films would probably be considered tame by modern standards. The 1950s brought in a new level of the monster movies. While Frankenstein and Dracula and the Bunch were monstrous, they still resembled humans very heavily. The 1950s changed this by releasing Creature from the Black Lagoon in 1954, Invasion of the Body Snatchers in 1956, and The Blob in 1958. The creature feature also becomes prevalent in this decade with the release of the 1954's Godzilla. It is debatable whether kaiju movies count as horror, but they are at least horror adjacent and influence the horror genre heavily. In the late 40s and 50s, the comedy group Abbott and Costello made horror comedies where the titular characters meet the universal monsters. The mass distribution of television in the 50s created the iconic anthology show The Twilight Zone, which started in 1959, as well as Alfred Hitchcock Presents of 1955. Hammer horror becomes popular in the late 50s and creeps into the 60s with their take on the classic horror monsters like Christopher Lee's Dracula. Then the magical year of 1960 came. Psycho comes out in 1960 and completely changed the genre. Psycho arguably created the slasher subgenre of horror, which will eventually become synonymous with the horror genre as a whole. There are many arguments of what the turning point for horror was in the latter half of the 1900s, and I argue that it was Psycho that changes it all. Also in the 60s, Roger Corman and Vincent Price created a series of horror films based around the works of Edgar Allan Poe, The Pit and the Pendulum in 1961, The Raven in 1963, and The Mask of the Red Death in 1964. The PCA disbanded in the late 50s. As well as the stringent studio system, this gave way for productions that had more creative freedom and gave them the capability of portraying more taboo topics. Enter the legendary George A. Romero, the king of zombies. In 1968, George A. Romero released Night of the Living Dead, which some people cite as the turning point for horror instead of Psycho. Night of the Living Dead created the zombie subgenre of horror, which would become incredibly popular. Because of the PCA dissolution, exploitation films, which I talked about in my Texas Chainsaw Massacre video, become prevalent, but become even more common as we get into the 70s. The 70s and 80s began a new age of horror films, precursed by Psycho and Night of the Living Dead. I argue that this section of film history is the true golden age of horror. With the PCA gone, exploitation and splatter films emerge. Even the standard horror movie pushes the envelope much more than in the previous generation. The slasher subgenre comes to fruition in this era, with the most iconic slashers of all time coming out. In 1974, Black Christmas and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre are released. In 1978, Halloween, arguably the greatest slasher of all time, is released and paved the way for the slashers of the 80s to come. Wes Craven, probably the most important and influential figure in the horror genre, makes his breakout movie The Last House on the Left in 1974. He then follows that up with The Hills Have Eyes in 1977. These two are incredibly influential, but not even his best or most important work. George A. Romero continues his zombie streak with Dawn of the Dead in 1978, which is his most known and influential work alongside Night of the Living Dead. Carrie is released in 1976, becoming the first in a long line of adaptations of Stephen King's work that will dominate the genre. Direct-to-video becomes a more common medium in the 70s and ushers in a long line of B-movie horror films that coincides with exploitation films. Alien is released in 1979, popularizing the idea of sci-fi and horror combining without being a doomsday film. David Cronenberg elevates the body horror genre with Shivers in 1975. Then the 80s come. The slasher subgenre explodes in the 80s. Wes Craven becomes the king of the horror genre with A Nightmare on Elm Street in 1984, which spawned an insane amount of sequels. Sean S. Cunningham releases arguably the most iconic horror franchise of all time in 1980 with Friday the 13th. The success of Halloween and Friday the 13th led to an endless amount of slashers. Sleepaway Camp, 1983, My Bloody Valentine, 1981. Friday the 13th would have 8 movies come out between 1980 and 1989. Child's Play in 1988, just to name a few. Art house superstar Stanley Kubrick releases The Shining in 1980 as well, elevating the horror genre above its B-movie status. Vampire horror films like Fright Night and The Lost Boys of 1985 and 1987 become popular and specifically differentiate themselves from the archaic vampire films of the past. Special effects are becoming more sophisticated in this post-Star Wars era, leading to some of the greatest practical effects ever put to screen in David Cronenberg's The Fly from 1986, John Carpenter's The Thing in 1981, and An American Werewolf in London in 1981. The first half of the 1990s spells a lull for the horror genre. Besides a few outliers like The Incredible Misery in 1990 and The Silence of the Lambs in 1991, the horror genre was mostly just the reboots of the classic 70s and 80s slasher, which were starting to get so bad to the point of parody. I'm talking Jason Goes to Hell, Halloween the Curse of Michael Myers, and Freddy's Dead bad. Then the beautiful year of 1996 comes around, and horror has never been the same since.
Hello?
Scream is arguably the most influential horror movie of all time and is Wes Craven's finest work. The slasher subgenre was putting out its worst movies, and Scream comes along with its self-reflexive metatext and reinvented the genre. 1997's I Know What You Did Last Summer succeeded in this reinvention of the slasher subgenre in the wake of Scream. Scream's critique of the genre made most horror movies after it have to confront these tropes. Even the slasher sequels had to have some sort of metatext to them, such as Halloween H2O in 1998. The incredible J-horror film Ringu, or The Ring, comes out in 1998 and sparks American remakes in the 2000s that have lasting impacts to today. In 1999, The Blair Witch Project is released, proving to the world how low-budget indie horror films can still be incredibly successful, and started a new genre of horror, the found footage film. The 2000s still continued remakes and sequels to classic slasher films, and to the point of ridiculousness. Jason X comes out in 2001, which is one of the most entertaining movies you'll ever watch, but not necessarily the greatest. Freddy vs. Jason is released in 2003, which had been begged for since the 80s and was in production hell. It pinned the two most iconic horror characters ever against each other in an epic battle. And then it turned out to be an absolute piece of garbage movie. But anyways, now I'm editorializing. Rob Zombie gets his directorial debut with House of a Thousand Corpses in 2003, which I'm not the biggest fan of, but he does have some diehard fans and eventually rose to remake Halloween in 2007. Like I said earlier, J-horror films are getting American remakes like The Ring in 2002 and The Grudge in 2004. While you should just watch the Japanese original because they're better, the American remakes are still quite good and made a foreign genre popular in the US, which is very uncommon. While horror comedies have always been a thing through the 80s and 90s with the Evil Dead series, they became very prevalent in the 2000s with the release of Scary Movie in 2000 and its subsequent sequels, all of which owe their success to Scream, which was ironically originally titled Scary Movie. The Final Destination franchise and the Saw franchise debut in 2000 and 2004 respectively. While these two franchises are very polarizing with how people perceive them, they become an incredibly dominant force in the genre. Saw both pioneered the controversial torture porn subgenre of horror, and also jump-started the career of James Wan, probably the most important figure in modern horror, who created the Saw, Insidious, and Conjuring series, with both Saw and The Conjuring being in the top 5 highest-grossing horror franchises of all time. Piggybacking off the low-budget success of The Blair Witch Project, the Paranormal Activity series debuts in 2007, becoming one of the highest-grossing horror franchises ever on a dirt-cheap budget by utilizing clever filmmaking techniques inspired by found footage films. The zombie craze comes back in the 2000s as well with films like Wreck in 2007 and its American remake Quarantine the year later. The zombie king himself, George A. Romero, makes a comeback with Land of the Dead, Diary of the Dead, and Survival of the Dead in 2005, 2007, and 2009. Romero was very clever with how he named his films. Zombie content becomes so prevalent that it even hits the point of satirization in the 2000s, with 2009's Zombieland and 2004's Shaun of the Dead, which are both masterpieces. The Walking Dead debuts in 2010, making zombies a household concept. Classic slashers also get the remake treatment rather than just sequels. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake comes out in 2003, Halloween is remade in 2007, Friday the 13th is remade in 2009, with A Nightmare on Elm Street being remade the year after. These remakes do fine, but aren't generally regarded as living up to their potential. They have flashy modern takes on the characters, but seem to lack the soul that the originals had. They don't have the same staying power that the originals had, and mostly died out until the late 2010s with the massively successful Halloween reboot. The 2010s became an extension of the 2000s, with the stagnation of the slasher subgenre and the rise of paranormal films. Some slashers remained like Cabin in the Woods and Hellfest, but they were not as prevalent as in the 80s. The Conjuring is released in 2013 and creates the highest grossing horror franchise of all time, with 7 films in the universe coming out between 2013 and 2019, with the 8th one coming out in 2021. With the advent of streaming, horror television took off with hits such as The Walking Dead, American Horror Story, and Haunting of Hill House. The 2010s also helped elevate the horror genre into more than a B-movie status over multiple films, rather than just one film sticking out. Cabin in the Woods, The Witch, Midsommar, The Lighthouse, The Babadook, It Follows, and Mother all debut in this decade, which are some of the most academically studied horror films. With the postmodern lens of the 21st century, many of these horror movies fight against the previous films' casual racism and sexism by using the horror genre as commentary on these issues. Jordan Peele rose to prominence in the horror genre in the 2010s with his portrayal of black people in films like Get Out and Us in 2018 and 2019. Like I said before, Halloween was rebooted in 2018 to massive success and spawned a sequel that came out this year and another sequel coming out in 2022. While still connected with the 1978 classic, the movie feels very different being made in the 21st century, displaying women in powerful positions rather than falling into the final girl tropes. It looks like the horror genre is taking a wonderful turn, becoming more intellectual and more interesting, and I'm so excited for what the 2020s hold for us horror fans.